Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to get further into HeroQuest and what I call HeroQuest in depth, where we're specifically going to be talking about playing effective heroes, which is a natural follow-up to my last video, which was on basic hero strategy. So let's talk about playing the heroes effectively just a little bit. So we've got Barbarian, Dwarf, Elf, and Wizard. And of all the different heroes to play, the Barbarian is the most straightforward. The Barbarian is the frontline fighter, he's got the most body parts of all of the heroes, and he's got the most attack dice of all of the heroes as well. So really, there aren't a whole lot of choices for him to make on a turn. He's not going to be casting spells, so not going to have to worry about what spell to cast or anything like that. Basically, the job of the Barbarian is to go forward and to attack and use those 3 combat dice, because that's what 3/8, that's not quite half, but it's close to half of all of the general combat effectiveness of the entire party at the start. Now, of course, some heroes may get some other equipment later, but generally speaking, of all the 8 combat dice that the heroes have available to throw at monsters during any given round when they all start out, 3 of them are held by the Barbarian. And that means the Barbarian has got to get in there and throw those dice because he represents so much of the combat strength of the entire party. We talked about 2 different places where the Barbarian might go in the lineup. Most people generally consider it natural for the Barbarian to be going first in the player lineup, so the Barbarian can break open the door and go in and deliver the damage, and then the other heroes can try to figure out what to do next based on what the Barbarian was able to do with his broadsword. I also think that it's a pretty good strategy to have the Barbarian go in the last position. That way the Barbarian can clean up and see what all the other heroes were not able to do and where he is most effective, can most effectively be played right before Zargon's turn comes in. Especially if the Wizard goes in, casts some kind of spell, and then needs protection, the Barbarian can go in and provide that before Zargon's turn comes up. So there isn't a whole lot to playing the Barbarian, but I do find that a way to not play the Barbarian is timidly. You don't want a timid player to play the Barbarian. You do want a player who is comfortable with being on the front line, who is comfortable with taking the risk, and playing the game like that bravely and boldly. If you have a player who plays the Barbarian very timidly and doesn't like to get in the way of danger, isn't comfortable being on the front line, the combat effectiveness of the entire party of heroes is going to suffer. And so don't do that. Find the player who is bold, who is capable and willing to take on that role, and isn't trying to, for example, sneak around and just get all the treasure or something like that. The combat strength of the party, a lot of it is sitting there with the Barbarian. The Barbarian must be bold. Okay, the Dwarf. The Dwarf has 1 less body part than the Barbarian. He's got 7, whereas the Barbarian had 8. And he also rolls 1 less attack die when attacking when starting out. He rolls 2 instead of 3. So basically, the Dwarf is our secondary fighter. Once again, the Dwarf doesn't have a lot of decisions to make. The Dwarf needs to go in there and attack because the Dwarf's not going to worry about casting spells. Of course, the Dwarf does have the ability to disarm traps. All of the heroes can do that if they have a toolkit, but the Dwarf can do that at any time, and he's the best at it. But that's kind of a specialist role. When there's a trap, the Dwarf is sent forward and knows what to do. So outside of being called upon to handle a trap, the Dwarf needs to be a secondary fighter and basically be right there beside the Barbarian through all of that. If the Barbarian throws 3 dice, like he does, and the Dwarf throws 2 combat dice, that's 5 out of the 8 combat dice for the party right there. So that's over half of the combat strength of the party when the Barbarian and the Dwarf go in beside one another and go in and attack. The Elf is the hybrid character. The Elf has 1 less body part than the Dwarf does. The Elf has 6, whereas the Dwarf had 7, but the Elf gets to cast spells. Both the Elf and the Dwarf have 2 combat dice worth of attack when they start out. One of the choices at the beginning of the game is what spell list or what spell category is the Elf going to take into the dungeon with them. So when the spells are being sorted out, of course there's earth, air, wind, and fire. A Wizard gets to choose one of those, and then the Elf player gets to choose one that's left, and then the Wizard gets the rest of them. it seems like optimal spell strategy for the elf to get one of the healing spells, which the elf should be able to do because there's one healing spell in earth and there's one healing spell in water, and the wizard can only choose one of those sets anyway, and so there's going to be one of them left over for the elf to take. So this has a number of advantages. First of all, it means there are two different heroes that have healing spells. That does mean that in one round, if the heroes get really desperate, it is actually possible for the heroes to cast two healing spells in the same round. The elf can cast one and the wizard can cast one. That would not be the case if, for instance, the wizard has both healing spells, because the wizard can only cast one spell per turn. So you're limiting the amount of healing that you can do on any one round in the most desperate of situations if the elf is not holding one of the healing spells. We found that it's often best for the elf to take the earth spells, and that's because not only does it have one of the healing spells in it, but it also has rock skin, which is a defensive spell. Now, some people might say that, well, the wizard should have the defensive spell in order to increase the number of defense dice that the wizard can roll. And that certainly does make sense. You could certainly play it that way. But if the other heroes are actually going to be actively defending the wizard, then it makes less sense for that magical armor to be on the wizard than on, for instance, the elf, or another hero in general, because you can cast it not only on yourself, but on somebody else as well. Because we're expecting basically the elf to be the tertiary fighter and to be out front and potentially defending the wizard physically, it seems to make more sense for the elf to go ahead and get the earth spells and to cast it on himself or herself early on in the game. Because the elf is this hybrid role in combat and spellcasting, the elf is often a very popular hero to be played at the table. Now, let's talk about the wizard, because I've found that of all of the characters, the wizard is actually the one that's most difficult to play effectively, and that has to do with the magic system in general, because the wizard is not only the least physically capable, the wizard only has 4 body parts and only rolls 1 die in an attack roll. That makes the wizard physically weak and physically vulnerable. He can't dish out damage physically, and he can't take very much damage either physically. But then the wizard also has the spells, of course makes up for it by having a catalog of 9 different spells that he can cast. But in HeroQuest, once you cast a spell, you have to turn over the card and it can't be used again. So there's a lot of reasons with the wizard that I found that players who are playing the wizard character often play the wizard very conservatively. First of all, the wizard gets played conservatively because he doesn't have that many body parts. He loses 4, the least of all the heroes, he's dead. Coupling that with a lack of ability to go up and attack and try to actually kill something, or have a high probability of killing something, that's a reason right there for wizard players to play conservatively with their character. Now that part in general is okay, because wizards, you would think, being frail, would be rather conservative when they're going down into a dungeon. Okay, so what do you want the wizard to be doing if not going up and being a frontline fighter? Well, you want the wizard to be casting spells. But the spell system in the game also kind of prompts the wizard to be conservative because of that factor of losing every spell. You can only cast each spell once, and so I found that some players, in fact a lot of players, want to, of course, naturally use their spells in the most optimal location they possibly can, or situation they possibly can, because it's going to be lost. And so they want to make sure they get the biggest bang for their buck whenever they cast any particular spell. This sometimes tends to lead to the wizard not doing very much on his turn. He's not in physical combat. Often, sometimes, if he's playing late in the lineup, he doesn't have line of sight to a target anyway, unless it's a hero and he's casting a defensive spell. But then also, thinking conservatively and trying to make sure the spells are held until the best possible moment during the game tends to not cast a spell either. And that's a problem. If you've got the wizard and he's playing so conservatively that not only is he not in physical combat legitimately, but he's also not using his spells, then basically you're dropping a quarter of the entire hero team without Zargon having to actually do anything. So basically the heroes are losing a hero if the wizard doesn't actually actively do things on each turn. See what I'm saying? The wizard has 9 spells, so 3 from 3 different categories. So, in one sense, of course, that doesn't sound like a lot. But on the other hand, how many turns are you really going to have during the entire game of HeroQuest? Well, it's not that many in general. How many times is the entire game going to be played around? Generally speaking, in most quests, there are not that many rooms. There, are not that many monsters. You're not going to be in a situation where you need to cast a spell every single turn anyway. So let's say you get 12 or 13 turns. Well, 3 or 4 of those are definitely ones where you're just walking around or trying to get positioned, where you're not really trying to cast a spell anyway. But then on the others, well, that's 9 spells. You should be casting the one that in that particular situation, on that particular turn, happens to contribute most to the goals of the heroes. A lot of wizards will want to hold all of the spells until the end. And of course, in general, yes, you do tend to fight a large, boss bad guy at the end, but how many rounds of that combat are you going to be fighting that boss anyway? 1, 2, maybe 3, probably not more than that. And so if you still have all 9 spells when you enter the final battle, you're not going to be able to cast them anyway. And so, what does it matter in general if the spells are cast earlier on in the game that provide advantages, which then allow the other heroes to have preserved more of their capability, probably hit points, basically, so they have more of their resources toward the end of the game, even though the wizard might have less. That's also a completely valid way to do it. It gets the spells out there, and I think it's probably a more effective way to do it, because you don't want to have the spells uncast. If the spells go uncast by the end of the game, well, what good do? They don't do any good. So they might as well be cast during the game. So for this reason, I find that it's best if the wizard is played in not an overly cautious or overly conservative way. Players who are okay with being a bit bolder, even though they have less hit points, and even though their spells are, do go away after casting, players who are actually okay with casting their spells, with doing things with the wizard and being active every turn, play better wizards, and it makes for a more effective hero team all the way across the board. Alright, so that's what I have on playing effective heroes. We built a 3D jumbo-size HeroQuest board. I got videos on that on my channel. Please come by, check that out. Also, I've got a lot of other videos on tabletop gaming, fantasy, action figures, all that kind of stuff on the channel. Please come by, check that out. I got playlists of all the different topics. Pick the one that you're interested in, check that out. I look forward to seeing you in another video, and until then, happy gaming.